This conference will now be recorded.
Yeah, so welcome to another live session, everyone. And today we have Robert, who is a software engineer at Google. He joined Google, I believe, around a year ago.
Yep.
So he has some really good knowledge, like still, fresh in his memory about like how he prepared, what strategies he used, and like how his experience was. So, um, yeah, Robert, if you just want to introduce yourself, and then we can just open up to the questions.
Yeah, definitely. First of all, thanks for having me again, Harsh. I joined Google last year in September, so I've been there for, let's call it a year and 2 months at this point. Um, and yeah, I'm happy to talk about, I think like kind of a few key things are like, what to expect in a Google interview or what to expect in a technical interview in general. What I think are like kind of like high efficiency strategies for going about preparing, and how interviewers would rate various dimensions of your performance. So, if anyone has any questions, and Harsh, you can feel free to let me know how to facilitate this. But I think last time we just had people enter in the chat box if they had questions, or just speak up, I guess. So whatever's easiest. Happy to answer any questions about
Yeah,
those or any other
yeah.
questions in general. Yeah.
Yeah, everyone feel free to speak up or type questions in the chat.
Hmm.
It's totally fine.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, so any questions?
I guess I'll start. For the Google interviews, is there a cooldown
Hmm.
period like the other periods? And if so, did you have multiple rounds until you got actually into the company?
So I'll answer those two questions separately because I think those are two separate questions. By cooldown period, do you mean like if you fail the interview, like you have to wait a certain amount of time before re-interviewing?
Correct. I recently interviewed at
Right.
LinkedIn, and they had a 6-month cooldown period, I
Yeah,
believe.
yeah. So I don't remember off the top of my head what the cooldown period is, but we definitely do have one as well. I think a lot of these tech companies have these cooldown periods of either 6 months or a year. It definitely is in your advantage to be reasonably prepared, like to have like a, I mean, Harsh, you guys have like this community of people, so I'm sure you guys can get a good calibration and a good sense of like whether you have a reasonable chance of passing or not. And I think only then should you go for the interview. You should go when you're prepared because otherwise you're going to have to wait a few months to a year. And the second question, yeah, you do have multiple rounds. So generally, it's a phone interview followed by an on-site, which will consist of 4 to 5 rounds. I believe the current distribution is for entry-level hires. It'll be um, every one of those will be a technical interview, meaning like a coding challenge type interview, and one of those will be a behavioral one. So that's the breakdown.
Wait, so you're saying for new grads, one of them will be a behavior interview?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. Hmm. Hmm. I think this is being done at other companies
And
as
this is
well
mostly
now.
for new grads.
Um, I think that's the behavioral interview is different depending on the seniority of role that you're interviewing for, but I think you can safely say that everyone will get a behavioral interview. Um, yeah.
And what about system design?
So yeah, that's a good question. So for entry level, so it depends on the company, right? But I would say in general, you won't get um, a system design interview. There are certain companies that will do a system design, but I think that's a really bad practice because you just don't know how to design a system as someone who probably has like not too much work experience. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense because at that point you're just like kind of spewing keywords and stuff that you thought of by like reading some guide online somewhere. So that's doesn't provide a good signal. I will say that if you do have like even a few years of work experience and you're interviewing for a mid-level role, you should be expected to know about system design and should be expected to interview for that. I had a few friends who recently switched jobs, and they went through that. So at the mid level, it's system design plus the stuff that you have to know for entry level. So they'll still quiz you on leak code, but also system design.
Hey, can you tell us something about how you prepared and how you built up to
Yeah,
your interviews?
yeah, absolutely. So I think the best way to prepare is, yeah. So I see another question in the chat that's basically like kind of the same question. So the preparation involved a lot of, I guess I'll call like focus practice. So a lot of it involved. So first of all, the main platform I used was LeetCode.com. And I'm speaking for myself, right? So I guess the typical disclaimer of like, this is just my experience, and it's not meant to be taken as like generalized advice. But I do think that this is an efficient path to studying. I bought a subscription to LeetCode Premium, which I do recommend. The reason why is just because it organizes questions by company, which I found to be extremely useful when preparing for various companies. I thought they gave a lot of good focused practice, and the ROI for me was very clearly there. If it helped me get at least one job offer, then it's already paid for itself, right? So I think the target level to aim for is like LeetCode mediums, especially at the like let's call them like the like the top tech companies. They'll probably ask you about that level of question. I think LeetCode hards can show up, but the frequency at which they show up and the fact that like you're probably going to need some hinting from your interviewer in the interview anyway means that in general, focusing on mediums is the best way to like kind of secure an offer from like a decent tech company, I would say. So I'm going to follow up on this. So I'm trying to keep up with the chat. And the next question is about how you know when you're reasonably prepared. I think part of this is the intentional practice, right? So when I practiced, I did a few things. First is like you want to make sure that your questions are spanning a wide topic, a wide amount of topics. So you want to be sure that you're getting like BFS questions, DFS. You want to make sure that you're getting questions of all different types as well, of all different like formats as well. So like oftentimes a common pattern that I talk about when I'm coaching friends and stuff to help them with the interviews is like when you see a 2D array, it's kind of likely that it'll be a BFS or a DFS question just because the structure of that lends itself to being a BFS or DFS. That's not always the case, but it's just like kind of like a pattern that you learn to think about, kind of like a heuristic as you do like more and more of these problems. So I recommend doing a wide breadth of these problems. And moreover, on top of that, I recommend that when you're doing these problems, you focus on, at the beginning, making sure that you actually get your solution to compile and pass all the test cases instead of just looking at the solution looking at the solution, like you just go on and you look there for like a few minutes or so and you're just like, I don't really know this, but I'm going to try to memorize the solution. I think it's more effective in the beginning if you solidify your coding foundation and making sure that you're able to pass all the test cases, even if it takes you a while. Because I think in general, there's kind of two parts to mastering this like LeetCode style interview, I would say. I think the first is you need to know what algorithm you have to use to solve the problem and how do you massage the input of the problem to get it to be in a form where you can solve it using some algorithm that you know of, like dynamic programming or BFS or any one of those, like kind of like the common, I would call them the common algorithms in your toolkit that you should have. And that's part of being decently prepared. Once you have the high level approach down, and you're like kind of like, yeah, like this is how we massage the problem, this is how we like roughly do it at a high level, then the second part is that you need to be able to code it and make sure that your coding doesn't have a lot of errors and is bug free and runs in the optimal time and space complexity. And I think the two are kind of separate because if you know what the high level approach is, that's a matter of mechanics at that point, because that's a matter of just like, if you know the high level approach and you know it's a BFS, that's a matter of you typing out the BFS like on either like you write it on a whiteboard or you're like typing it in the console at that point. And so that's almost like kind of like how much have you been coding before that? So that's kind of like how I approached it in my mental model, and I think that helped. Um, and then the last thing I would also mention is that once you are reasonably confident in your coding and like you feel like coding feels, you feel like you're making less bugs as you're coding, and you feel like your coding is getting faster because you're typing BFS over and over. Then at that point, I would recommend that if you want breadth, um, if you think that the coding part is like pretty solid, then you should just think about the high level approaches. So once you're pretty solid on your coding, I would read questions and spend about like say like 20 minutes or so on them and see if you can figure out what the high level approach is. Chances are if you can't figure out what the high level approach is in 20 minutes in an actual interview, you're not going to do too well in that question. So that's kind of why I set the time limit for myself like that. And that might help you absorb more material in a short amount of time. You need both. You need to be able to do the high level approach, and you need to be able to translate that into code, right? But I think the two can be trained on separately. And so that's how I'd recommend maximizing efficiency when you're short on time. Yeah. So Anish asked about when would we be reasonably prepared. So I think I partially answered that question, but also to add on to that, I think that like being reasonably prepared means that like your friends or like for instance Harsh or I don't know who is mock interviewing you guys, but for instance I would trust the feedback of your peers and your instructors because I think that's a really valuable resource that not everyone has access to. I think a good mark of reasonable preparedness is when they think you are reasonably prepared, and I think I think that's pretty much the best marker. Yeah. Other than that, I would say like once you've solved a decent amount of LeetCode mediums across a decent amount of categories, if you don't have that marker, or if you want like another marker. So as far as numbers go, I think I did about like I think I solved meaning typed in and like had it go to the online judge. I don't know, 50 to 100 mediums, but I also did my approach where I did like the breadth first approach and kind of read medium problems. And I would say I read about like 300 or so problems and tried to like figure out what the high level approach is. So that was kind of my overall approach. Cool. So I'm going to move on to the other questions. Application engineer interview process at Google. I unfortunately don't know too much about that process. I think you do have a similar coding round, but so in general, all the other engineer interview processes will have some type of coding interview. It might be watered down in difficulty, and they might have some other specific component, but that's generally how they'll assess you. However, I have not done one of those interviews, so don't take my word for that. And unfortunately, that's all I can offer on that subject. Can you describe interviews? Were there any difficult parts? I think interviews are really nerve-wracking. I think that's the most difficult part. I think a huge part is your mental game. Like, just as important as your preparation is your mood during the day of the interview. Whether or not your past interview, like if you have an on-site with like 5 interviews, right? Like, did the past interview go well, right? I feel like that's like a common thing where like people have like hot streaks or cold streaks, right? It's like, oh man, I screwed up the first question of the day. Like, I think my chances are over. Like, like I might as well just think about how I can use their dinner reimbursement. So that's not a good way to think. And to compound on that, I think the issue is that the interviewer's demeanor tells you, so this is like all about the mental game. I think this is like something that's difficult about interviews that's orthogonal to like the actual difficulty of like kind of solving a problem under time pressure. Like the orthogonal difficulty is that like sometimes you just can't read the interviewer. Like sometimes interviewers will just stone face you, and other times interviewers will be really happy looking and like they'll be like always nodding and agreeing with you, but those two may not map to how they're actually thinking. So for instance, the happy guy, like maybe he's just always happy. He or she is just always happy and always nodding and agreeing, but you're going down the completely wrong path. And unfortunately, they don't care. And they're just doing it, right? Because they, I don't know, want to encourage you, possibly. there's a lot of different like interviewing styles, right? So one case is you could be completely wrong, but the interviewer gives you the impression that you're right. Another case is that the interviewer just doesn't even say anything and kind of like is stone facing you, and you're just like, I don't know what's going on. I don't think this interviewer likes me very much. It's possible that the interviewer just isn't very sociable. Maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe they really didn't want to come drag down here to interview someone. Any number of reasons. Anyway, and they can be like, this candidate is pretty good. I would recommend that we hire this person. So I think part of it is like having confidence in your own ability and like kind of like trying to the best of your ability and not like fishing for hints and not getting either like weighed down or like, feeling better because of some external factor, like how the interviewer is treating you because the question, let's say, is really hard. Like I think a really pressuring thing for me was like when I got dynamic programming questions in interviews, because in my opinion, I prefer to code in Python for interviews because it's like terse. A lot of these dynamic programming questions were just really like kind of almost math questions in disguise. And like I would spend like 10 to 15 minutes just thinking of the formula, right? And like the coding, this goes back to the whole idea of the coding might not even take that long in the first place, or it might just be something that I've done so many times before. And like I would be able to write the code in a matter of like a few minutes, but because it's like 10 lines or so. But the really pressuring part is when you're just standing there on the whiteboard and you're like, I don't have anything down, and like, should I keep talking? Should I try to make progress? Like, I think like the progress in an interview is non-linear. I think that's also another difficult part, right? So like accuracy is the most important thing. Like speed is secondary to accuracy. So I think one of the key takeaways is that a difficult part is like don't try to make linear progress, right? Like if you feel like you need a few more minutes to think, then I would recommend that you do that. Okay, so
So on that note,
yeah.
I think the interviewing philosophy at Google is very different from, let's say, like a Facebook, right? Where in Facebook they kind of emphasize on like speed and accuracy. Maybe accuracy might be slightly secondary.
Right.
What have you seen like from Google's perspective, what they prioritize?
I think that I do not think speed is prioritized. I cannot speak to how people are interviewed at Facebook. I have heard that is the reputation as well. Facebook, like kind of, it's like, it's like how many LeetCodes did you memorize, basically. But I mean, like regardless, like I think in general they're all pretty similar. I think Google has an approach where like accuracy is more important, in my opinion. I think accuracy always comes first. Like obviously it's the best if like you're totally accurate, you come up with a complete optimal solution in like 10 minutes and you code it perfectly. That's the ideal case. That probably happens so rarely that that's just just a pretty rare talent at that point. But I do think accuracy is the most important thing, because there's a lot of ways that you can follow up on a question without requiring like explicit coding, for instance. And you'd be surprised how far you can get by being like accurate, but also like getting all the code down and having it be bug free after like you say like you run through the code, like you kind of hand simulate it. Even if at some companies it's like you have to solve two or more of these questions. I do not get that impression at Google. Personally, when I ask my interview question, like without diving into the details, consists of a warm up plus the actual question, and even the warm up takes some candidates like 30 minutes. So I think like it's probably less of a concern than people expect, and I would say, I guess, especially like given my personal experience interviewing at Google, I think accuracy is the thing to prioritize for sure. So I'm going to move on to the other question. So someone asked, how did you pick your LeetCode questions to study, random in categories? So I think I followed this approach. If I had like an upcoming interview like really soon, like I just filtered by that company. If I had an interview at Airbnb, I I had just clicked Airbnb and I ran through all of them. Because I think for most companies there's like 50 or less, like maybe like 30 or less. Google and Facebook, they have a ton of questions though. So yeah, that's how I pick my questions to study. If I were under time pressure, I think that's still like the most effective way. There's a pretty high hit rate, at least when I use LeetCode Premium. Otherwise, I would go and I would just go in order actually. So that to me that is random, right? Because I don't know how they order the questions, but I would just be like, okay, today I'm going to work through 550 to 560 in LeetCode, and that's in the mode where I was like reading the question. When I was actually solving the question fully, I would do like 2 or 3 per session maybe. So, but when I was reading the question, I would like go for like 10 or so, because it's faster that way. So basically randomly, right? I wanted even distribution across all categories. And also, when you do it in categories, you have the prior knowledge of the category that you're doing the question in, which is an advantage. You don't have that advantage when you're actually interviewing, right? So you don't know, part of the interview is you don't know what type of question this is. You don't know if it's a tree traversal or what have you, string parsing. Do you need to use a stack here, whatever. So because you don't know that, I also find random is helpful. And there might be like tags or something that kind of give it away, but I think random is more helpful. Unless specifically you just know you're super weak in a certain category, like you're clearly more weak in like 1 or 2 categories than you are in everything else, then of course focused practice makes sense. But I think in general, if you can, to simulate the actual interviewing environment, you should do without the prior knowledge of which subcategory question this is, because that'll help your kind of like pattern matching skill, your like a meta pattern matching skill. Yeah, I think that's useful. All right, Rumi is asking about TPM interviews. So how are they different from software engineer interviews? They're quite a bit different, I think. So, so I think there's much less emphasis on coding. I think this is true across most PM jobs, but not all. Some do definitely require you to actually explicitly write code. There's more emphasis on, and disclaimer is also I haven't done any TPM interviews. I have had some. I do like coaching clients on the side, so I have had some that came to me with like some TPM requirements, either for Google or otherwise. And I think the general impression I got was like there's a lot of focus on system design and like market fit type of questions. But also for the system design, it was twisted a little bit such that it was more for like, it was a little more business facing as well, right? So I think the software engineer version would be like, design me a URL shortening service. And maybe the TPM analog would be something like, design me a ticket ordering service and explain how you could bring this, like explain how you would market this or something like that. That's a pretty vague description, but I guess the emphasis is that it's not purely, so less emphasis on coding, more emphasis on system design, and more emphasis on like kind of like business thinking, I think would be a decent way to frame it. Hopefully I'm not doing that too much injustice. Yeah.
Okay, Robert,
Robert,
there's some sound, there's a clicking sound coming from your, is that from your mic?
I'm not sure. Was there like an echo or something?
It looks like it's, let me try muting you. Yeah, so it's from your mic. There's like
Okay.
a clicking sound going on.
Oh, that just might be my heater. I apologize in advance for that picking that up. Is that really annoying? I can like move somewhere else if that's like
yeah, well, if you can, that'd be great. Yeah, it's pretty.
Okay. Okay.
It's pretty
Sorry.
evident.
Okay.
Pretty loud.
Try moving outside. Yeah, it's one of those old heaters. I live in New York, so we have a lot of noises everywhere.
All right, this is perfect.
Is it better now? Okay. Sorry about that. Okay.
Yeah, it's
So
perfect.
cool. All right. I'm just gonna go back to the chat. Feel free to chime in, and also anyone to feel free to ask a question, like just through like through audio as
So
well.
there's a question that's interesting. Like LeetCode has 1,200 questions now.
Okay. That's
What
a lot.
I
Yeah.
guess what approach do you think?
Yeah.
When you were preparing, were there far less or?
There was still like way more than I did, right? So like there were like 800, 900 questions maybe. Um, I, no one has time for that. I mean, right? So, like, I think, I think there's definitely a critical mass where you just start to see patterns. So, like, I think that's why at the very beginning, like, you kind of go in with like no knowledge of like any of this stuff, or like, say you go in with the baseline knowledge of like, you know what all these different algorithms in your toolbox are supposed to do, but you haven't gone in with like battle practice, right? So you haven't like gone in and like done any of these questions. So you're kind of just like floundering on like easies or mediums, which is pretty much what everyone goes through. Um, and like as you gain more and more practice, like at first the easy question takes you like maybe an hour, and then all of a sudden you do so many that you've just seen this one before. You can do it in 10 minutes now. So it's like about deliberate practice, I think, and kind of always absorbing like what the key lesson or two is from each question. I think that's far better to trying to like memorize a lot of answers. Um, and so I guess what I'm trying to say is that the more questions you do, I think the shorter it takes you to like gather the key lessons from the question. Kind of going back to what I was saying about like how I think after I coded about like 50 to 100 or so. I was still learning Python at the time, so I was like trying to like put together all the LeetCode tips and stuff about how to use Python differently. And I would aggressively Google Python syntax I didn't know. So I think I came out like much better in Python than I started as well as a side effect. But towards the end, right, I was just like reading questions, and I was more like drawing diagrams and like just being like, this is a topological sort where I just do it this way, than actually like trying to code the question. So I think once you reach that critical mass, once you reach that point, then you can do as many questions as you want. It just won't take you that long. But also, consequently, once you reach that point, every additional question you do is going to give you less of a skill improvement, I guess, percentage wise. It still will give you a skill improvement, of course. So I think there's a point where you just have to judge the diminishing returns. And then I think finally the final surge is like, you have an interview at LinkedIn tomorrow, just spam all the LinkedIn questions, or just at least take a look at all of them. So I think every kind of strategy has its time and place. But I would say in general, the fundamentals ramp up pretty quickly after you reach that critical mass. You're just like, okay, I think I know what this question is asking. I think I know what type of question this is. And then the way you can test that is instead of actually doing the code, you can just like look at the solution, right, and see if the solution matches your general understanding. And I think once you reach that point, you should feel like you're in a groove. That's the general advice I would give. It definitely gets faster once you reach that critical mass. So I'm going to go back to the chat questions. We have for an Eng manager position, 10 years, greater than 10 years experience, is coding interview also conducted? Yeah. Well, so I don't know this for a fact, but I was watching a YouTube video. I don't know if you guys watched this guy called Tech Lead. He was describing his interview experience at Facebook, where he was interviewing for an engineering manager position, which is, I believe, like L6 at Facebook, E6 at Facebook, I mean. And so he had one LeetCode round. He had a bunch of system design rounds and a bunch of behavioral rounds. And the behavioral is like different from what a new grad behavioral would get or an entry level hire. Entry level behavioral is kind of like, tell me about these scenarios, and like, they want to make sure you have like some amount of emotional intelligence and that you're not a jerk to work with, but also like you're decisive. So like, I don't know, like if you got asked a question like, oh, like your coworker is stealing your ideas, like what do you do, right? So like in general, there's like a bit of like kind of like trying to solve things amicably, but I think like also knowing when to put your foot down is the general kind of tone that you want to strike in behavioral interviews. Um, yeah, I think that's pretty much like the right way to go about behavioral interviews. I haven't done too many of those, so I don't have too much additional expertise to offer. But when you get to an engineer manager level, the questions become much harder. They would be stuff like, and this is all secondhand information, so take it with a grain of salt, but they would be things like, your direct reports are fighting with each other over various projects, like what do you do to step in, right? So there's a lot of like interpersonal stuff related in those positions. The leak code part, from what I can gather, is less emphasized. So whereas like in an entry level interview, they have nothing to judge you off of but leak code, because that's kind of an exercise that anyone with any amount of experience can like more or less like have a fair footing in. They kind of judge you mainly on that. But when you get to the EM level, engineer manager level, like sometimes sometimes they'll just ask you a few questions to make sure that you can still like kind of code, to be honest. Like I remember in the video that I watched from this YouTuber called Tech Lead, the questions were all leak code easies. Like I was like, yeah, I knew how to do those. Like I did those like when I like started my practice, right? So I think there's less emphasis on the leak code, which I think is pretty reasonable too. There's more emphasis on system design. That's where your technical knowledge has to be deep. Like system design and experience, like when you distill that, like people have a lot of knowledge with that. And like that's the knowledge you should be accumulating as a software engineer. It's kind of like, how do we make these trade-offs? How do we shard this system? How do we load balance this? What are the bottlenecks in the system? Are we write heavy or read heavy? So they're just completely different from the leak code questions, to be completely honest. And they start getting like they start becoming kind of important at the mid level, I would say, and they only grow in importance as you go further and further up the ladder. Right. So Anish asked, how has the past 1 year been at Google? It's been good. Teams, people, and work culture, work-life balance, etc. I think the nice thing about Google is there's a kind of a good distribution of people, like with like work-life balances. So what I mean by that is like, and like this is very team dependent, right? So this is only on my team, and I can only say for my team, but it strongly depends on your team. I think like depending on the team that you're on, this can also change, but also certain companies have worse reputations for this than others. I would say Google is one of the more laid back ones as far as tech companies go. So personally, I think that people who are like gunning for promotion definitely put in the hours. I mean, like when I say put in the hours, they don't even put in like that much more. Like, but like people who are gunning for promotion might be doing like 40, let's call it 40 to 50 hours a week. And people who are either coasting or kind of like, trying to maintain like a decent pace, but not like trying to like go super fast. It's a standard 40-hour a week gig. I would say that one of the things that I've noticed is that it depends on how you're using your time. I think that like both a blessing and a curse of tech companies, I think it's mainly a blessing, but they don't really care how much time you spend on the job, right? Like if you can like rewrite like Google's indexing infrastructure and make it like 20% faster with no other degradations in a week, I don't think that's possible. But like if you could, just hypothetically, and you spent like 10 hours doing it, no one would care, and you'd probably just get promoted. On the other hand, if you are struggling and you can't produce any meaningful results, which could be due to a variety of factors, right? One of the most common is like it's just a bad match for your skill set. So there's a variety of factors. But I mean, in that case, no one's going to care how much you work. Effort will not play. Effort does not play like. Effort is not explicitly marked in your performance rating. Let's just put it that way. Like in general, the harder you try, I would say that I think that's positively correlated with your performance rating, but that doesn't really matter. And so I think the consequence of that is that you can work, but you can like passively work, right? So I personally did an internship at Oracle, and when I went to Google, I thought the difference was night and day. Like I think at Oracle, let's just say that I was on Reddit a lot more and I was just kind of like chilling a lot of the time. But at Google, I try to like when I'm in the office, like besides like getting lunch and stuff, I try to like make my time like solely at work on work. Um, and so it's part of it is the hours you work, but part of it is also like how efficient are you at these hours, right? Like, are you taking a 30-minute YouTube break here and there? Like, no one's tracking your time, right? And like, there are employees who do this. They're just on Facebook all day or whatever. So it depends on how you use your time. I would say if you're using your time like decently efficiently, like I think a 40, maybe like 50 if you like have a lot of catching up to do and like, like you kind of just like new to everything in general. Um, it might take you like a little bit longer, but I would say focus like 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 being intentional about like how you spend your time at work is the most important factor, more so than like a number of hours spent. But I would also say that Google is pretty good with work-life balance, at least in my personal experience in the last year I've been here. And the people are really nice. And I feel like I've grown as a software engineer as well. So yeah. So how many questions, RP asks, how many questions are generally expected to answer in a coding interview for experienced developers, 10 plus? Right, so this is like the LeetCode style interview, I assume that you're talking about. And I mean, the answer here is just I mean, it's kind of a shifty answer, but it's like more than everyone else. So it's like if you get asked a bunch of LeetCode easies and like let's say the average like engineering manager can solve like 2 of them, then you should at least be at that bar. But it's not a number of questions thing. Again, in my personal experience, for the question that I ask a warm up and a follow up. And if for me at least, if you answer both, like I'm gonna mark you down as like probably like we should hire this person at the very least. So it just depends on how difficult the questions are, and also for experience, they're gonna care more about your system design as well. But I would say you want to like be at the floor at least in all categories, right? So you can have like peaks that carry you, like maybe your system design is super good, or like maybe your LeetCode is super good. Your system design is like about average for people of that much experience. Um, um, I think as long as you meet the floor for everything, you can like kind of see where your strengths lie and try to uh, like really do well on certain types of interviews. But so the TLDR is I don't think there's a number. I don't think it increases. I think actually the emphasis decreases on these, but they still want to make sure that you can code. Unless you're an IC. Maybe if you're an IC's individual contributor, it might be different. But um, I think in general, there's more of an emphasis on system design. Okay, so Charan, I'm sorry if I mess up these names, is asking how a data science interview differs from a software engineering interview. It's a good question. So I think in general, it depends on the role. You can expect in a data engineering interview. Actually, my girlfriend is doing this process right now, so I can speak a little bit about her process. So again, kind of secondhand info. But for data scientists, they expect a minimum of how to code. So I'm gonna put this like your coding should be about at the same level as let's say like someone who has like taken like a data structures class and can do the bar for coding is lower than it is for like a software engineer, right? For coding, but they're gonna ask you other stuff like they'll ask you statistics questions, and they will ask you system design, quote unquote system design questions, but it's more like system design and like you're given this data set, what kind of algorithms would you use on it? Or it'll be something like or for the coding question, for instance, it could be a generic one, but it could be something like, I want you to code me k-means from scratch, something like that. So I would say the questions are different. There's kind of an overlap when it comes to the coding part, but there also is the added part. So the coding part is a bit watered down, and then there's this added component of stats questions, kind of like business case based questions from a data science perspective, like how do you use this data, stuff like that.
So AK asks, how long did you prepare for the interview at Google? Did you feel low or burnt? Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a pretty common sentiment, I would say. I prepared for about 3 months. Um, and this was like part-time preparation, right? So this is like when I would get home, I would do uh, like I don't know, 2 or 3 full questions, or like I think I mentioned, like once I got pretty efficient at them, I would be doing like reading 10 questions per day, with my definition of reading. Um, so for about 3 months, did I feel low or burnt out? Yeah, some days I felt like I was like crap. I couldn't answer any of the 3 questions that I set out to do, or like my hit rate would be like super low. I'd be like, wow, I suck. Yeah, it's a mental marathon, right? It's about your mental game. Persistence really is really key, and it wasn't only for Google that I prepared. I think you should go into the process thinking that it is a bit of a crapshoot. It depends on how much your interviewer is. I don't know. Like, do you just is the question that your interviewer asks a question that you can pattern match into your brain instantly, or is it going to take you like 30 minutes? No one knows, right? So, like, your preparation is a factor that you can control, and there's other factors outside of your control, like, uh, you know, like, is this interviewer going to ask me a question that I just click with, whatever. So for those reasons, it's somewhat of a crapshoot, but your concern is increasing the percentage that you will pass a given interview, right? Because I think in general, if you're interviewing with a lot of these tech companies, the good thing is that they all ask the same flavor of question. They're all asking these, at least at the entry level, they're all asking these kind of lead code style questions for the most part. So if you fail Google, if you fail Facebook, but you get a job at like LinkedIn or Yelp, like you're done, right? So, you can go out and celebrate and you just be like, all right, cool, I got my tech job. So because they all ask the same questions, and some of them might have like easier bars and some of them might have harder bars, but at the end of the day, they're all the same thing. So um, I strongly recommend applying to a lot of places and seeing where you can get callbacks from. And I guess related to this, you didn't really ask this, but I'm going to mention it anyway, is like leverage whatever you got. So like if like you're in the final rounds at Google, or sorry, not like let's say you're in the onsite at Google, but you really want to interview at Twitter, like just be like and like depending on like where you are in the Twitter process, maybe you're at the resume screen or whatever, just message your recruiter and being like, hey, I have an onsite at Google, and I was wondering if we could expedite the process. I think that's a really useful trick because it costs you like nothing. It just costs you nothing to type that. And it's very fast, and it's possible that it could just actually have a material acceleration on some other company. What's even more pressing is if you have an offer from a company, then as soon as you get a single offer, message every single other company you're in interview rounds with, or every company, like every company you're interviewing with, plus like companies you really want to work for. Just be like, hey, I have an offer. I'd love to interview, but the clock is ticking, basically. Like not in those exact words, but this is the concept of leverage. Everyone wants an engineer who is already hired. So there's a bit of a snowball effect there. It kind of sucks when you don't have any offers, but as soon as you get one, play that game. I think it's very useful. I think it can accelerate the process a lot. So Prashant asks, compared to Microsoft and Amazon, how would you rate the difficulty of Google? I'm also sorry, I don't think I'm going to get through all these questions during this time, but I'm going to try to get through as many as I can in the last few minutes. So the Google difficulty, I would say, is higher than Microsoft and Amazon's. It's about on par with Facebook's, and it's lower than very hot startups. So when I interviewed some of the startups that were asking like had a really high engineering bar in my mind were like Airbnb, Palantir, Dropbox. But if we're talking about FANG, like Facebook, Amazon, no, or okay, let's make it Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Facebook and Google. I think Facebook and Google, I would call them like solid, like you should know your LeetCode mediums pretty well. I would call Microsoft and Amazon on the easier side as far as big tech companies go. I do think they are on the easier side. And yeah. Sri is asking what level of math is required for the Google interview? Nothing really. I would say like it's more of like the logical basis you get by going through programming interview questions, I think serves you well for thinking about, I guess, all the math that you need to know, which is pretty much like big O notation, I would say, for the most part. It seems like there's a relation between like how, like if you've had some exposure to like counting problems, like stuff of that type, and dynamic programming, I would say, like kind of like that kind of pattern, recursion, matching. But I don't think there's any like math you specifically like is required. I do think that like a course in discrete math is useful for like just thinking about how to. The reason why I say that is, well, maybe not discrete math, but like a proof-based math course, if you have taken one, is useful in my opinion because a proof is like kind of the formal way in mathematics that you convince the other person that you're right about some mathematical topic. In some sense, that's what you're doing, like in an interview. Like you're trying to convince the interviewer that you know what you're talking about. And so, like, if you know how to do, like, say, a proof by induction, that can be really helpful for a problem that like requires that type of scenario, like a dynamic programming question, for instance. It's just a thought. It's not really a hard requirement, and that's definitely a nice to have. It's definitely a thing to think about if you have the time. So Rob Rogers asks, what is a good way to indicate to the interviewer that you want time to think? Yeah, that's a really good question. You should just tell them that you need a few minutes to think. I would always say though that like, in my personal opinion, I've always preferred just drawing stuff. Like even if it's dumb stuff, I always prefer just like drawing stuff on the whiteboard because I always thought that it helped me like think better as opposed to like keeping everything in my brain and like just trying to organize the thoughts. I thought just writing some stuff on a piece of paper, even if it's not code, was helpful. Like a common example of this is come up with test cases. Write a bunch of input and output test cases to test your understanding of the boundaries of the problem, I would say is a useful thing to do. But you can just ask them. You can just be like, I'm just going to take a few minutes to think. But I would say if you take more than a few minutes, think about if you could write some stuff down. I think chances are you should be able to like write some stuff down. It doesn't have to be code. It's the main thing. It doesn't have to be code. But there should be something you can write down, like test cases, for instance. Yes, LeetCode does have quite a bit of questions. There is no need to do all of them. That's just my comment to that comment. Oh, I see. How do you choose which ones? I think the random approach that I mentioned earlier is the way to go. I think you should target, like, do like a diagnostic for yourself and be like, where do I think I'm weak? Do some questions of those first, but then again, you in an actual interview, you don't have the prior knowledge of which subcategory this question is coming from. So that means that you should do random questions. That is the most useful way, the most accurate way. Yeah, I'm sorry about the heater. I'm seeing the comments here. Okay, so Jackson said, did you feel like there was a bias towards a particular type of question at Google, as in graphs or DP problems? Personally, no, but I mean, I'm sure there's some bias in the data set of like the question bank that we have. I do think those are two pretty common things. I do think that BFS/DFS and dynamic programming will pretty much always come up in like an interview that you're doing. So those are pretty common archetypes. I wouldn't say there was a particular bias when I interviewed. I kind of just ran the gamut of a bunch of stuff. I was asked like a BFS question. At Microsoft, I was asked a dynamic programming question. And then at Microsoft, they also asked me to reverse a linked list. And then there was another question like design Minesweeper. It really runs the gamut. I would say like Microsoft is probably more likely to ask you a question like design Minesweeper than another peer company. Like some companies like to ask this object-oriented style of question. Other companies don't really care for it, and are thus more algorithmic, but not a huge difference, I think. Sorry about the sound again. Okay, if you're Anish is asking if you're a working professional, how many hours would you recommend? It does get tiring. Um, yeah, it does get tiring. I would say like think about like what other things that you do after work, right? Like, I think the way to think about it is to reframe it. And the short answer is like I think 2 hours a day is a good target to strive for. Um, I think there's more than enough time to do that, assuming that you're working a 40-hour a week job. If you're working some crazy job, then sure, that is definitely going to, you know, dig into your preparation time, and you're probably going to have to spend a lot of time prepping on the weekends. But it really comes down to like what you value the most, and like what like what's your goal, right? It's like how fast do you want a new job? How badly do you want a new job? Uh, et cetera, et cetera. I think 2 hours is a good amount. I guess the way I'd reframe it is like think about like what you take to do 2 hours on, right? And see how you can like cut that out somehow, or see if you can um, stick in 2 hours of practice by like maybe like you like to watch TV after work. Maybe you can like chop off 30 minutes to an hour of watching TV and replace that with like do a LeetCode question, and then you can watch TV. Or I don't know. I think there's more than enough time in a day to do your 8 hour workday, commute like an hour each way. Maybe let's call it like 10 hours you spend at work, and then um, I think you can fit in 2 hours. So, oh, Syed is asking, what do you mean by read a question? Yes, this is exactly what I mean. It's read a question and come up with a high level solution. So it would be something like, for instance, there's a question on LeetCode called find eventual safe states. That's question 802. I just did it with someone. So that question is a topological sort question. So sorry, spoiler alert. But basically, like for that specific question, I didn't actually like write the code, but I was like, this question is a top sort question, and this is how I would proceed in doing the top sort, such that I get the final output. Um, so for instance, that's like one way uh, to speed up your interview process, because then you can just cross-check yourself with like some solutions, and you should be able to know very quickly if that is the correct solution or not. Um, and that's what I mean. I think that's a good way to balance breadth and depth once you think you're pretty confident in your coding ability. It saves a lot of time. Like, what's the point in writing BFS for the 50th time, even if it's slightly different, right? There, the answer is there's not much point. So skip it and focus on um, massaging the problem to an algorithm instead. So Anisha asks, should we attend other interviews before we interview at Google if the focus is to only get into Google? I don't think that should be your focus, because I think there are so many good tech companies to work for, and I think your focus should be land a job, because as soon as you do that, you get experience and like you're in the game. Um, and like I think in general the practice that you're alluding to is what I'll call like this is something that people you only like you need to have the luxury to do this, right? But if you have all these interviews lined up with companies that you would prefer to work for less than Google, and you have a feeling that their interviews are easier than Google's, then yes, do them first, because they will knock the interview jitters out of you, so that when you do get to the Google interview, you've had like maybe some embarrassing moments stamped out of you, and you're more prepared. Definitely do interviews in like as time constraints allow, do interviews in like increasing order of difficulty for sure. I think that's definitely a good way to go. Like generally increasing. You don't have to like rank them all. Um, yeah. Robert asks, any tips for domain specific interviews? Um, Probably nothing of value to add here, but like you have to know the domain in addition to knowing like if it's like for instance like SRE, site reliability, you have to know a lot of stuff about like Unix, like TCP/IP, that kind of stuff, like how to like scale up and down jobs, whatever. In addition, this is all in addition. to the LeetCode stuff. So if anything, the only advice I can offer is you're probably looking at a superset of information to study. Yeah. So Sunil asks, could you tell us more about, I think I'll answer this question and then the question right after, and that'll be it. So Sunil is asking, could you tell us about your timeline from start to getting an offer? Sure. So I started preparing in about June. I definitely am someone who like gets more intense as the deadline is approaching. So I think in June I was more casually preparing, but I was still definitely like trying to like squeeze in probably like an hour of practice each day. Like I would go to work, come back. It was kind of tiring at first. I was still getting used to like just spending a lot of time at work too on the new job. So that's kind of like the process I used. And I would just go home. I would like make dinner for myself, and then I would do LeetCode. Not directly. I first watched an hour of Netflix, and then I would tell myself to stop being lazy, get off, and do LeetCode. So I did that for about a month. Over the weekends, I would try to get in like 2 to 3 hours of practice. I think the main thing is discipline. I would say like I was doing LeetCode practice like 5 out of the 7 days of a week, like between week and weekend, which I thought was like a pretty reasonable rate. So let's call it like 20 days in a month. In July, I started preparing more, and in August, I started, in addition to applying, actively applying to places. So I actively applied to like a bunch of places, and I emailed recruiters when I had the contacts. Otherwise, I just applied online. And the interviews that I had were, I had an interview with, my first interview was with Palantir. And then I had an interview with Snapchat. This is not an ideal way to start off your interview cycle, by the way, but they were like, can you interview now? And I'm like, fine. And then after that, I had, let's see, what did I have? There's probably more companies sprinkled in. I'm only going over the highlights of what I can remember. In September, I think the ball really got rolling. I had an interview with Microsoft. I had an online assessment with Amazon. And then I had on-site with Google, a phone interview with Facebook, and a phone interview with Airbnb. So I passed all the phone interviews except for Airbnb. Oh, there was an online assessment from Dropbox, which I also, so I failed the Dropbox and Airbnb ones. I passed all the other phone rounds. In October, Snap said they're not actually hiring any people, so I was like, okay, guess not. And then I did an on-site for Microsoft and Amazon in October, got the offer for both of those. Got rejected from Palantir at the on-site after doing the on-site. I got the offer from Google in October as well. I completed the phone screen with Facebook, and at that point I was like, I'm too burnt out. I don't care anymore. I just signed it, and I'm like, I'm done. So that was my process. I didn't negotiate, by the way. In hindsight, that was probably a mistake, but I'm going to keep that in mind the next time that I do this. I think negotiating is a very high efficiency thing. It doesn't take a lot of time, and there's pretty much only upside. So strongly recommend you do it. Nevertheless, I'm very happy with my offer. And yeah, that's basically my preparation. I will also note that like the more offers I got, the worse I started doing in interviews. So I think those were correlated. When I wasn't relaxed, I think I had more adrenaline. So as soon as I got more offers, I was like, wow, I keep failing these left and right. I probably don't care enough anymore. So yeah, I think that also made it hard for me to negotiate.
So
Yeah.
how long did it take you to the whole process? Like you started in June.
Yeah, it took me 4 months. 4 or 5 months?
4 months, okay.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. It was like 3 months of like
Okay.
pretty
That's pretty quick,
focused.
actually.
Yeah, 3 months of focused preparation. Then I started applying really hard. And then 2 months of pretty focused interviewing. And like a lot of processes I just left hanging. I was like, I don't care. I'm going to answer the last question from Manish here. If we're asked a question that we have seen during our preparation, how do we go about answering this? That's a good question. I mean, it's kind of funny because a lot of interviewers have different opinions about this. Some just don't even care. Some will just be like, like I can't condone this behavior, and I actually haven't had this happen to myself. So like all the questions, it's hard to say, right? Because sometimes the question is just pattern match. It's like this question is like so similar to one I've seen, but it's not the exact same thing, right? Like, do you call that out? The honorable thing to do is to call it out. But I mean, like in reality, if you can just like fake it and be like, hey, like you know, like if your interviewer doesn't suspect anything, like I think the main thing is that like two things stick out to me. One is it's kind of hard to draw the line between like um like if you've seen this question like recently before, like if you've memorized the solution, they will know for sure. Like if you memorize the solution and like you just balk when like they ask you a follow up, like they'll know, right? But if like you've internalized the solution to a point where like you get it, like you get why this is a BFS and like you get how you could optimize on it, then like you know you should just like say it as you have it. Maybe like say the brute force way first, and then like I don't know, like some people like feign a few minutes to think. Like I can't condone this behavior, but I'm almost positive I've had like people who have done this like to my face, right? And I just haven't like noticed it. So because like LeetCode, like everyone is asking the same questions. Um, but think about how you would answer follow-ups to that question. And the other advice is like if you just memorize the question, like and you're just gonna spew out what you memorized, you're not gonna stand a chance because they will find out. But if you actually like get the answer, then I don't know. I like that's a gray area, but I mean, um, pretty sure it's happened to me before as like an interviewer on the other side. So if I'm interviewing you, I probably won't be able to tell, but I will ask you the follow up really quickly. So if there's a big discrepancy there, then it's pretty obvious. So I just think that's something to keep in mind. It's like you have to know the solution, plus you have to like have the coding down pat. It has to be like a whole package, right? For the facade to for the facade to work. So um, that's how I'd recommend
Yeah.
going about it. Yeah. Um, yeah.
Cool. Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Robert, for your tips. I think everyone would
Yeah.
finds it really useful.
Absolutely.
So uh, yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks all for
Um,
coming on, and yeah, feel free to hang up.
for sure. Yeah.
And
Thanks everyone
yeah,
for listening. Um,
I'll take.
yeah. Take care, everyone, and have a good night. Thanks so much for having me on, Harsh. See ya.
Thanks. See ya. All right, so I'll answer a few of the other questions that we have here. Um, so let's see, what other questions do we have here? And feel free to, by the way, just jump in and ask any follow-ups that you have. Um, so let's see, where were we? Okay, so there's questions about system design interviews. So what are some good resources to practice system design? So there aren't many. I would say, with system design, it's all about gaining as much knowledge as you can, like targeted knowledge about systems. So I usually suggest you, of course, like the course itself has a lot of these things, but take a look at 5 or 6 easy research papers that describe these systems, because that's your source of how these systems are designed, right? It really gives you insight into people who do this for a living, right? How they think and what trade-offs they look at. And so those 4 or 5 papers are really useful. And I think in the course I have links to those papers. Other than that, Grokking the System Design Interview is an interesting website, but don't follow their format. They put too much emphasis on like estimating um, estimating the number of systems and things like that. Those typically are not that common. So don't use it as a template. Use it more as just like another resource for gaining knowledge. Um, and then, yeah, I think those are the only sources I can think of. Anyone else have any success with system design interviews, or resources they know for system design? Anyone find any good resources or want to share their experience with system design interviews? So there's one suggestion here, highscalability.com. Yeah, that's a good one. Anyone else want to share their experience? So there's a question here. Okay, so let's move on then. There's a question here, how would you compare exercises on your website with LeetCode? So, so the problems on our website are like the most common problems, and they're categorized by, the algorithm. So I would say that we kind of do the job of structuring your preparation, right? LeetCode has like 1,200 questions. You really don't know how to go about it, and so I kind of look at Interview Camp as the way to start learning and to master these concepts. And then if you really want to do like 200 problems, not solve them like manually, but just to look at 200 more problems, you can do that at LeetCode. So the exercises, most of the questions on our website, you'll find similar questions on LeetCode.
So,
yeah, what other questions? So we'll just do general Q&A. Yeah.
I have this general question. When we have a technical phone screen interview lined up, and you're getting closer, like a week or something, how is it a good idea? I mean, how do they respond if we ask them to like postpone the interview? I mean, if we put in a request like that, is it a good idea, or will that leave a bad impact?
No. It's actually, yeah, they don't see that negatively at all, right? If something comes up and you cannot do the interview in the next week, it's perfectly fine to schedule for a week or two later. I think it depends on the reason you give, right? If you say that you need some time to prepare, at big companies that's totally fine. At like small startups, they might wonder why you need 1 month to prepare, but generally it's fine to delay your phone screen at big companies and companies that are constantly hiring.
Okay, thanks, sir. That makes sense.
And by the way, the same thing applies for on-site interviews too. So it's not restricted to.
Okay, great. That's good to know.
Yeah. Any other questions? So there's a question in the chat. I'm having trouble reading the interviewer when on site. I seem to make steady forward progress in coding and get positive signals when discussing system design, but so far haven't able to get offers. What could be the issue? Do technical interviewers judge based on behavior, communication, chemistry? Yes. So what you mentioned, behavior, communication, those things are very important, right? So they are judging you on that as well. So if you're saying that technically you think you did well, but didn't get offers, I would highly suggest you do a mock interview and see if the interviewer has anything to say about your behavioral communication component, because and like before you do the mock interview, make your interviewer aware that you're looking for feedback on the behavior communication side, so they and for candid feedback, so that they don't hold back on it, right? Because a lot of times with behavior feedback, A lot of mock interviewers, they don't want to give that because it's kind of uncomfortable, right? So make sure you tell them that. So what do you recommend for mock interviews? I would recommend interviewing.io, Pramp, P-R-A-M-P, Pramp.
Can you spell
Those
that?
are good.
Oops.
Yeah, so I'll spell it here. It's
Sorry, Aaron.
interviewing.io, P-R-A-M-P, and there's many other websites that do that. I think Gainlow is another one. Yeah. Okay. Let's see, what else do we have in the chat? Whoa. Oh, my chat screen. Okay, there we go. So if I'm stuck on any concepts in the curriculum, how do I get guidance? So I would say ping the Slack channel. If it's something specific to the course curriculum, like either me or other people will typically reply. Like in the Slack channel, you'll notice that the kind of questions that don't get replies are things that require a lot of effort to research and reply to, right? So if I have to research, or if anyone on the channel has to research for half an hour just to reply to one comment, you'll see that people, those comments don't get a lot of replies. But if it's something in the curriculum, then people already know about it, right? So usually those questions get quick replies. Is there a list for more homework questions from LeetCode? Well, so I would ask why you want to do more homework questions oh, I'm guessing you mean like with the same concept, is there more homework questions from LeetCode, right? So I would say try to focus on less questions first and just mastering those questions. Because once you do that, and then after that, when you go to LeetCode or any other site, you'll find that it's much easier to solve those instead of doing it at once, right? Because you want to build your pattern matching skills as well. If you're, as Robert said before, if you're just given these 10 problems, you're given the pattern and 10 problems with that pattern, then you don't build any like pattern matching skills because you know from beforehand what those what pattern is going to solve it, right? So I would suggest doing the homework problems in the course, doing them really well, and then jumping on to LeetCode and stuff for your to cover a breadth of questions and to cover like your pattern matching skills. And if anyone else has any, by the way, if you guys don't agree with that, do feel free to jump in and suggest anything. Or if you guys have any experience with that, definitely feel free to share by jumping in. Okay, any other questions? Any general questions or experiences people want to share? Okay, thoughts on TripleByte and Hired? Yeah. So TripleByte and Hired are both good for getting interviews. So yeah, it's a good. Yeah, definitely try them out once you're prepared. Has anyone gone through the TripleByte experience, by the way, and want to share their experience? I think that would be helpful for everyone. So, question here is, once we're done with this course, are there more advanced courses you recommend? Well, I think this course is as advanced as you get, right? Yeah, if you're good with this course, then I don't think you need any other course to crack the interviews. So yeah, definitely not. I don't recommend any other advanced course. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Any other? By the way, feel free to just jump in and talk. I think that's usually the preferred way. How do you suggest whiteboard practice? Can you elaborate on that? Like if you like to code on whiteboard. So I guess you're asking if you would like to code on whiteboard. So, I mean, are you asking how to improve coding on whiteboard, or are you asking if you should practice on whiteboard? Yeah, I typically don't recommend using online judges like LeetCode because you waste a lot of time. First of all, just running and passing all the test cases, it ends up being a waste of time because in a real interview, that doesn't matter. And also you become dependent on these online judges, so you don't develop the skill to like verify the solutions yourself, right? If you practice without it, eventually you learn how to verify these solutions yourself. And that's a skill in the interview that's really important, right? In the interview, you're supposed to verify yourself. You're not supposed to just click run and then have a bunch of failures and then try to fix those failures. So I think using online judges is kind of counterproductive. I would suggest typically my favorite way is to write on paper, right? If you have a whiteboard at home, you can write on the whiteboard. But in terms of convenience, I think if you just have a notebook and you code over there and then verify the solutions yourself, I think that's the best way. Okay. Yeah, does anyone else have any questions?
So Harsh, like I was asking about this phone screen interview earlier, right? I would just like to know what would be your ideal suggestion, or how would you prepare for a phone screen interview when you have like a week left? Having said that,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
after, especially when someone goes through all those basic algorithms and doing a BFS, GFS of the graphs and trees, I mean, after learning all those and practicing multiple questions, and you have 1 week or two left, what would be your suggestion on things to improve in that week, or what to concentrate?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the situation you're describing is ideal, which is, you've already prepared beforehand a lot of stuff, and now you want to like find the way to maximize this 1 week, right? So what I suggest is, the goal for this 1 week should be to put everything in your mind's cache in a way, right? Where you might have forgotten how to implement treat like a breadth first search, and it will take you, if you do it today, maybe like 20 minutes to do a breadth first search, because you have to think of all the cases and you're generally slow. But the goal in this 1 week should be to be fast at those common algorithms, right? So all these algorithms, you should put them in your mind's cache so that come interview day, you're really quick at them, right? And so if you look at the end of the course material, we have a section called Last Day Interview Prep. And it's called Last Day Interview Prep, but it's really, last few days of interview prep, which it lists a bunch of problems that you should practice. And those are representative problems which cover a wide variety of algorithms, right? And so if you could, practice those problems and coding those problems, then, then you kind of put those algorithms in your memory. And so you can do them faster when interview day comes. So that's how I would approach it.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Yeah.
Cool. So another question here is, in a real interview, what do you mean by test cases? Walking through edge cases and sample data, or actually writing test cases? So I recommend actually writing high-level test cases, right? At least a few of them. And if you look at the first section in the course, which is the ESTCV approach, we kind of walk you through the process. So yeah, before you write code, ideally you want to quickly write a few test cases, which include edge cases and some normal cases that you can walk through once you're done coding, right? So before you write coding, you have a frame of reference that you have to pass these cases. And so after you're done coding, you can kind of walk through those cases that you've written before and verify your code with them, right? And you can walk through the code line by line pretty quickly and just verify your code with them, with just one or two of them, right? And what you'll typically find is, and guaranteed, in like 90% of the code you implement, you'll find one or two bugs just by walking through those test cases, by walking through the code line by line. And that's a really good signal in a coding interview that you're finding your own bug instead of, the interviewer having to point it out. Has anyone else has any experience with that, by the way, in a real interview where, they've found bugs themselves or written test cases themselves? Or like not written themselves and the interviewer caught your bug? Any such examples people have had?
I certainly had lots of those.
I see. Where the interview caught your bugs?
It was a mix. I caught several, and interviewer caught a couple. So it's definitely a very important part of of getting through the questions.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, any other questions?
Yeah, Harsh, I know this gets asked even in Slack, but recommended problems from the group of problems that you have already selected for the different patterns that you've described. But I was actually just looking at what other design problems would you recommend? I mean, I don't know. I'm just sort of curious. You listed some. You have a separate section for that, but even other design problems that you would recommend as extra homework problems. I mean, you don't have to answer that here, or you could let us know later.
Yeah, you mean like system design?
Yes, because you have, I think, at least 4, I think 3 to 4, but I'm just curious if you have others that you recommend us doing for practice as well.
Yeah, we have like 6 or 7, and yeah. So I think the goal there is to kind of identify a template for you and how to think of system design. After those, you can pick up like any list of. So for system design, it's very the problem set is very kind of randomized. There's no like common list of problems, and so really you can really expect any kind of system. So after, if you've gone through all of the sections that we have, I would recommend looking at any like system design list online and kind of seeing and trying to do it yourself using these approaches, right? That's the best way to do these things. So there's like a bunch of questions, to be honest, and the goal here is to really set up like to practice this approach and practice creating system designs, right? So it's yeah, I would say just pick up any list of common system design questions, and their guess is as good as anyone else's, because system design is very the questions lists are very varied, right? There's no like common questions.
Okay, yeah, got it. I understand that the ones that you have listed have specific patterns which make it unique, and so maybe others might be more similar. But yeah, I understand what you're saying. It's just I've been doing some interviews, and I just noticed the system design questions I asked are some that I've never heard of. Questions like designing a distributed messaging queue, designing a network monitoring service. Yeah, questions like that. Even designing some billiard system that scale. Yeah. Anyway, it's. I mean, I think I take certain parts of what I picked up from the course, which has been useful and could potentially be applied to other design problems as well. It's just more like when it comes to these new problems, it's always interesting what you can come up with, just based off of these sort of common problems that we've been practicing with.
Yeah. With system design, that's a very big thing. That it's very open-ended, and so it's really hard. It's not like algorithms where there's a certain format and there's a certain pattern that applies to all these problems. With system design, it's much more open-ended. Yeah.
I just had one thought on the test, the number of like writing the test beforehand. So sometimes it has happened that so there was a reverse problem where you write the test cases first, but you don't have a good idea of how to really like what the algorithm should be, and so you start developing the code to just those test cases, and then it's not general enough. So that's just also something to just watch out for, where you might say, oh, I'm going to put a lot of ifs and if-else conditions to match the test case. But then the interviewer might point out that that's not like the general approach. Have a more generic solution that will work across a lot of cases.
Yeah, that's a really bad approach to use your test cases as templates, right? So that's why if you look at our approach, test cases comes right before you're starting to code, right? So you've already figured out your algorithm, you've figured out how you'll implement it, and you're about to start writing code, and only then do you write test cases, right? You don't want to write test cases before you know how the algorithm works, right? So you have to plan your algorithm like before. Don't even get your test cases before that, right? I think you might be confusing it with examples, right? You want to take examples of the problem, but in examples, you don't need to have extensive examples, right? You're just trying to figure out what the structure of the problem is. So you don't need like all edge cases and the examples you take. You just have to take a couple of examples just to figure out what the problem is like. So those two are like different things. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, no, absolutely. I was just trying to point out that avoid that situation.
Yeah, that could be a pitfall people get into, and yeah, definitely try to avoid that.
Yeah, on that note, my 2 cents is so it's good to start with kind of common use case. For example, if you are reversing a linked list node that's kind of in the middle of linked list, then that's kind of defining the general algorithm, and then kind of noting I'll need to come back to edge cases. Such as no empty list, one element of the list, less the element, that sort of thing, and then so edge cases translate into test cases, so that kind of level. So yeah, it's definitely very good to get kind of general purpose algorithm first, and then to cover edge cases through the listing of test cases. At least my 2 cents there.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. Yep, definitely agree with that.
Harsh, can I have a suggestion?
Yeah.
Harsh? Yeah. Okay. So, for system design, I think like I have some experience about my personal experience. I have some experience about some on-site interview, and most of the system design I think is really much like what we always talking in class, like very common use system like social media, like what we are talking about, some Twitter and then Google, Facebook, something like that. That is really common cases. And I think I heard a lot of like system design question like that. So, and especially in class, we also discuss a lot about that. So I think that give us a lot of preparation when we go to interview and we got asked this type of question. So we know where to start. But do you consider to talk about some not so common system? For example, like a few months ago, I went to interview with ADP, and they asked me some system about how you like every 2 weeks we got payroll. How can you design a payroll system like that? Like very like really rare system like that. Maybe like I told at that time I never heard about that. I don't even know where to start, so I got stuck in the very beginning for almost like 10 minutes or something. So have you ever considered talking about some system like not really like common ask question like Facebook, Google, like that?
Yeah, we do that all the time, right? So like a couple months ago, we did like coding competition app and things like that. The problem is, we try to cover the most common ones just because they're common. But the idea is that you should be able to use these concepts in those systems as well, right? So like a 2-week payroll system, that's kind of like batch processing, right? It's kind of like another batch processing job. And you can pretty much apply the same concepts there as well, right? So you should definitely practice applying these concepts to these different systems. But yeah, we are working on a lot more content with system design. So yeah, we are definitely trying to get more and more content in there.
To be honest with you, I totally understand all the system concept can be applied, but if especially when you go to on-site, you are really nervous, and when I ask you some question, you never think of, oh, there's a category I can fit myself into. Like says like if I was asked a social media question, even is a LinkedIn, is a Twitter, is a Facebook, to me, I was like, okay, I know where to start. But if I am asked a question, it's not really so common. Like I get so nervous, I don't really know where to start. So the more diverse system I can think of, I think that would be really good practice. I don't know. That is just my thought. And then also like back to the question, like a 2 weeks payroll, and then the follow-up question that asked me is, oh, because in general, like for the rest of the day, like the system is not sending you anything, but like for one day it's gonna be very high. Like how can you handle the capacity just only for high, like like a demand for only one day, and then for the rest of the 2 weeks, how can you handle that? Like that kind of question is that I never think of. So I was totally like lost in the very beginning. So just a few thoughts about that.
Yeah. No, yeah, definitely. We'll try to add more of these like different cases. Yeah, definitely. Trying to add more of system design stuff. So,
I believe a lot of people, like the people in our class, went to some on-site, and maybe they can provide some like a real on-site question, and then so we can discuss. I think that might be also a good practice, because I think it's really good to get other people's experience, because so many people go to on-site, and we should take advantage of that.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, no, definitely. I definitely always encourage.
Yeah. So yeah, one of the thing is that like you mentioned, right, on the ADP system design, that's kind of like they are pretty much expecting you to put in a domain, right? So think about your iPhone launch, right? So when you go to T-Mobile, when you launch a new iPhone, on that day, like if you watch some of the architecture videos, like their traffic is huge, right? And Apple site also crashed. So if you see Thanksgiving, retail is like that, right? So I think like basically I'm an experienced engineer. What I'm seeing is that there is a two type of brain needed, right? Your algorithm is your like which is your technical mind, like right side of the brain, and your system design is the left side of the brain, right? Which is kind of logical thinking, right? So when you start on the ADP, it's kind of yes, that is true, because your payroll has to process, and it has to it's kind of think about as a you just scale the application for a maybe 5 to 6 hours, and also they do a lot of pre-work at that time. So it's not like that you can instantly run everything, because there is a lot of behind the scene jobs going on, like what are the systems you are pulling the data, like WageWorks, your Medicare, your leave. Think about as a TriNet, think about as a ultimate software, like there are a lot of HR solutions, right? So they do exactly this kind of stuff. So yeah, I agree to you, like like when you go to the system design, it's kind of you really cannot prepare, because I'm seeing a lot of folks, right? They will directly how to design Instagram, Twitter. That is fine, but a lot of time you will be asked into various dimensions of the problem set, right? So yep, just wanted to share some of the thoughts.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely great comments. Yeah, I think it would be interesting to see questions that people have been asked in their interviews, and then maybe have a discussion on those. I think that can be pretty interesting.
So I have a quick high-level question. It's a bit of a dilemma. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
So I had a Google phone interview, let's say last week, and the result was borderline. Like, so they offered me another chance if I wanted. So let's say I can schedule it. It seems quite flexible. Other interviews I had, looks like I'm going to get an offer from a startup. So long term, I'm kind of interested in Google. What I'm thinking is, should I perhaps? So the dilemma is, realistically, to prepare for Google interview, I felt like I was maybe like at best 25% prepared. Would it make sense for me to just kind of like politely decline the, another shot and maybe say, let's circle back in 6 months to a year, or just take a shot at it without much prep? The issue is if I start a new job, I will not have much time or any time to prep. I don't know. I was just curious what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, so it depends on how prepared you think you are for the on-site. If you think that you're at a level where there's a good chance that you'll, crack the on-site, then you can always, then maybe you should continue with the process. But if you think that you're not at that level yet, then there's either two things you can do. One is use that second interview as just like a practice interview, or just don't do it, right? Either way, you're saying you'll take 6 months before you apply again, potentially. So really the question is, do you think you're prepared for the on-site interview or not?
Right. Good point. So I think the answer is no. I mean, I think I'm poorly prepared for on-site. If I was doing this full time, I would need another, I would say, 1 month. And I don't have that.
Okay.
For phone, I think I have maybe 50-50 or maybe a little better than that. So then if I decline, okay, backtrack. Let's say if I do another phone interview and it's bad, how much does it kind of hurt my record with Google?
Yeah, so it doesn't hurt your record. So first of all, there's no like hurting of record. If you didn't do well in an interview, like next time you go through these rounds, they're not gonna kind of penalize you in any way, unless there's some red flag that they found out, some really big red flag. The only difference is that if you get rejected, then you will have, they'll put you through the 6-month cool down period where in 6 months you cannot interview. Whereas now that you're borderline, you can interview again whenever you want within the next 6 months. So yeah, it's really up to you if you want to, block out the next 6 months or not.
That's interesting. So maybe I think that I kind of got my answer. So I'm kind of leaning towards declining now, but politely asking the recruiter, hey, is it acceptable if we circle back in maybe 2 to 4 months? So that's kind of catchy. In other words, if I can interview within the next 6 months, then perhaps I should decline, and then I have a shorter window, and I find out if the startup job is going to work out or not. So yeah, that's interesting. So, and perhaps I can do more of this course because I just started recently. It's very interesting.
Hey, I just went through the same experience. It's Harish here. I just went through the same experience with Google. Went for the on-site and I didn't get selected in the process. But the feedback came back that I was like got a green light from 4 guys, and 1 guy was given the hold for the hire. So the HR came back and said that they have a ranking system, it seems. I don't know what that is, but they said you are supposed to get around 70 or something, and I got around 65, something like that. And they said to me that you can apply back within a month because we would like to see have you here. And they gave me an option. Basically, you can apply back within a month, or you can apply back within 6 months, or whenever that is, whenever you feel you're ready for the next round. So that's why I joined the course, to make sure that I can upskill myself and go for the next round. But I think Google are very flexible in doing that. They don't take it back bad at all. They understand that the hard work you put in, and the HR who spoke to me was very friendly and said that They didn't go deeper into which points to improve, but they did mention about things to consider. And when I come back for the second chance of interview within the Google, so if you feel you're not ready, you should definitely give yourself time and go back. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, yeah. And in general, I think companies, especially the big ones, understand that, you may not have practiced before and you practice now, and that's fine. Like they're pretty forgiving in terms of algorithm interviews. Yeah, yeah. Unless there's some red flag, then that might carry forward to the next interview. But typically, that's not the case.
So on that note, I just was curious to know. You can hear me, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, just on this line of conversation, I was curious to know, like people are already working with, like the FANG companies, and the job is, I assume it's quite demanding. There's new stuff to learn on the job. Generally, like one is like, what is the motivation that they sort of have to prepare for interviews, and like how do they pace it out, or how do they plan? Like this is the time frame that I mean, I guess there's no real compulsion to move, but you kind of also want to prepare, but also want to do well on your job and learn all the new stuff that's happening that you're required to learn. So how do they balance out, just prioritize in terms of motivation and balancing all the various priorities?
Yeah, so I would ask, I would ask people on the call, there's two parts, right? First is like motivation, like what's motivating you to apply to these companies? Anyone wanna share in the chat or on talking? So I mean, I can start. I mean,
Can you repeat that
pay is the
question?
most obvious one. Yeah, so what's the motivation to apply into like Google, Facebook, Amazon, all these companies? Like, why are people motivated to apply for these companies?
I'm not.
Means I believe it is primarily on the technologist, right? Like if you are working on these companies, then primarily you are working on the future, right? I mean, depending apart from the financial aspect, like those definitely won't motivate in a longer term. But why people are going, there is two things, right? One thing is that they are really passionate about what they are doing, right? And impact. So basically, if you are changing something, like today, YouTube is completely redesigned, right? Like you are really impacting billions of people in a matter, right? Which you may not find every company the opportunity. Of course, you will face tons of technical challenges and your brand value. Like if you are coming out of, like these companies, then you don't have to really explain your technical capabilities, right? Tomorrow you can find some business, you can do a startup, right? Because you build that brand value. I think, those are the, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think one major motivation is that these companies are working on the latest and greatest technologies, right? And so, so you are, by definition, um, your skills are going to be pretty, tailored to the latest stuff, right? And that's something other companies want too. Whereas, in contrast, let's say that you're a web developer working on, let's say, ASP.NET, and like nothing against developers working on ASP.NET, but the latest startups don't want, like they don't use typically ASP.NET, and so your skills might be a bit. You might have to relearn other technologies in that case, right? Whereas with these latest companies, and I'm not talking just about the big companies, but even like latest startups, which are in demand, you typically you're working on stuff that's latest and more relevant to fast growth companies.
Sure. Yeah, no, thanks for that. So then does that mean that a person who's in a FANG company, they want to transition to another FANG company, let's say somebody working at Facebook wants to go to Google, will that Google employment automatically be a plus point for them? Because they would still, I'm assuming they would still have to go through the interview process, which is probably a little bit different than what they work in their everyday life. So somebody who's working at Facebook.
Yes. Yeah, so it will. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
So things will become a lot easier. So again, again, the technical interview will remain the same, but a lot of things become a lot easier as your career progresses. So an example is, if you're a developer, if you're a junior developer, then it probably won't add as much weight to your technical background or experience. So if you're a junior developer and you do well in interviews, you're probably fine either way. But as you become a senior developer or architect, and an architect at Google versus an architect at some unknown company, someone at Facebook would always value an architect at Google way more than someone they don't know about, because they just know that it's going to be very similar kind of jobs.
Sure. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And then the third part of
it does become easier.
Okay. Yeah. So that the final part of my question, then let's say somebody is a senior developer at Facebook. They're working on the latest, greatest. What would be their motivation to move to Google? And then how would they, how much time would be expected of them to prepare? In addition to their day-to-day Facebook job, how would they kind of prioritize applying and prep for Google? Just any thoughts around that?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a great question. So what happens is, once you've prepared, once you've spent maybe 6 months, depends on how long you spend on preparing, the next time becomes a lot easier. So the next time it's probably 1/10 or even less of the effort to prepare, because all these concepts you've already done before, right? You just have to revise them in your head. So yeah, the prep process becomes a lot easier after you've done it once. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. No, that. So basically you will still have to prepare, but because you must have already put in the effort for your first job at Facebook, when you want to apply to Google, you'll just have to inherently invest less amount of time. You'll still have to prepare rigorously, but that rigorous preparation will take less time because you already remember those concepts and things like that, right?
Yep, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, these are pretty good questions. Sorry, go ahead. Question?
Hello. Hi, Ash.
Yeah.
I had a question on the interview process. Say, for example, during a telephone interview or an on-site interview, you come up with a solution which has a space complexity of O of n, but if the interviewer had O of 1 in his mind, then but if you can't, and if you're not able to optimize the solution, how do they gauge you? How does it go?
So you're saying you came up with a solution,
Yeah,
but it
I was
wasn't
able to give an optimal
optimal.
solution, but it's taking O of n space complexity. But the interviewer has a O of 1 solution in his mind. So, and if I'm not able to come up with a better solution than the O of n, then how do they gauge you? How do they rate you?
Yeah, so it depends on how easy the transition from the O of n space to O of 1 space is. If it's a very different algorithm, then typically it's fine. Like O of n space, O of n time is fine typically. Like it depends on the question. Like if it's a very easy question and that O of n space solution was like kind of trivial, then a lot of times they look for the O of 1 solution, right? Because if it's a trivial solution for O of n, they were looking for the O of 1 from start. But if it's a more like medium or hard level problem, then and the O of n solution itself was complex enough, then it's typically fine. They may not see that as a negative thing, right? Unless the optimization from O of n space to O of 1 space was so simple and you're not able to figure it out. So they might take that as it's something you should have figured out. So it really depends.
Okay, got it.
But yeah, it's a misconception that you have to always come up with the best solution.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Hey, my name's Rob, and I just joined, and I don't know how to pronounce your name, the instructor. Harash, is that correct?
Yeah, I really don't care, but it's typically like Harsh. Yeah.
Harsh? That's a good.
Yeah.
Cool. Are we gonna talk about the problems at all today? I'm sorry. The problems in the actual course, or would that be for another interview?
So we typically don't talk about. So we typically don't talk about like algorithm problems that are in the course. This session is more like supplementary for like discussions and stuff. But yeah, if there are like doubts or questions about some problem that you were doing, then absolutely we like to clarify those. So this is more for like clarifying doubts and clarifying any questions you have in those problems. So yeah, definitely, if you have any questions about those problems, this session is great for that. Yeah, so hopefully maybe next time in our Q&A session, if you bring up any question about those, we'll definitely go over those. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I just started, by the way. Great course.
Harsh, I have a question about the test cases. Like when you're like during a on-site interview, let's say you are writing down the test cases, is it like okay, like to ask the interviewer if there's anything else that he has in mind, or like we should rather wait and finish the coding and then like so how does that work? Like let's say I missed out some edge cases. I have like let's say listed 2 or 3 edge cases, but there's some more as well. So is it okay to ask the interviewer if he has some other edge cases in mind, or we should just let them say if they think they need to tell or something?
No, yeah, don't ask the interviewer because they're not supposed to, like you're supposed to come up with the test cases, right? So yeah, definitely don't ask the interviewer. If you come up with a list of test cases, of edge cases, then it's fine. Like you don't need to go too deep into each and every edge case. As long as you have a few, it's fine. Like they're not looking for like this they didn't cover this edge case or anything like that. As long as you've generally covered good cases, it's fine.
Okay.
And that's something where again, be careful of LeetCode because LeetCode covers all these different edge cases where in an interview they won't even come up.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Let's see. Any last questions? So there's a question in the chat. What is the best way to apply for Google or Facebook positions? Through a recruiter or directly on their site? So, directly on their site is not typically a good way. It just puts you in this huge pool of people where it's hard to stand out. So definitely the best way is to apply through a referral. If you know someone inside the company, they can refer you. That's the best way, hands-on. And the second best way is to contact recruiters on LinkedIn and see if and send them your resume. That's the second best way. And then the third best way is through these websites like Hired and TripleByte and stuff like that. Yeah. But usually contacting recruiters on LinkedIn, if you contact 10 or 12 in the worst case, it's fine. They can. That's the second best way to do things. So to find recruiters, you just go on LinkedIn and search for, like Google Recruiter or something, right? There'll be like plenty of them.
Hey, quick question. This is related to question previously asked. So specific kind of like follow-up queries about interview questions and solutions listed on the website. Let's say, is there a simple way to just send an email and maybe with specific for that, or you can discuss it in a session, but then it may not be interesting to all the people?
So you mean if you have questions about a particular question, like algorithm question?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's three ways, I guess. One is to look at the comments under, like post it in the comments under the section. The second is the Slack channel. The Slack channel might be more responsive. And the third is in these sessions, right? So in these sessions, when we have our Q&A like we did now, you can ask any algorithm question as well. Yeah, from the course.
All right, fair enough. Thanks.
Hey, Harsh. Sorry, this is Rob again. How you doing?
Yeah.
So just to follow up,
Good.
so one of the things I'm doing is I use TDD, and so for example, I'm finishing up the permutations and combinations part of an array of integers.
Yeah.
And so you print them out, and I've been using JavaScript, and I've had some like bizarre return results that I can't explain. And so where you were like, just print the buffer, print out like what the current buffer is, I will actually return the buffer and then basically concatenate the results back up to a final list and then verify, what I expect is what is returned. I don't have a specific question this time, but that's the kind of like one of the issues I'm facing right now is, say, rewriting their permutations or combinations code to actually return results and then matching those up. So the question, the thing I'll just put out here is just to follow up with, the previous commenter is that it would be nice to be able to have not a venue. What's the word I'm looking for? A place to ask this question. So I guess the number one solution is Slack. And do you monitor the Slack channel at all? I guess.
Yeah. Slack, and the comments below the section are probably the best place for this.
Okay, super.
Anyone can see this while preparing. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, any
Hey,
last questions before we wrap up?
one more quick one. What do you think about HackerRank?
HackerRank, I mean, all these websites are similar. LeetCode, HackerRank, HackerEarth, they're similar. They give you a list of questions and you kind of try to solve them. So
Right.
yeah, it's just very similar to any of these.
So the thing with HackerRank that's interesting is it could be both good and bad, right? You basically you know type in solution. There is a button to upload it to their server, and it actually compiles it and runs it against their test cases. So they develop test cases automatically, and you know that takes away the experience from us to come up with test cases. But on the other hand, it makes it quicker to run through the problems. The other interesting thing, and I did not see that on LeetCode. So do you see that as good or bad? Secondly, it's interesting, at least one company sent me a test from HackerRank, and it's like a time test. It was 1 hour, and it's kind of like, pass fail on time, really. The questions were relatively straightforward, but the time was tricky. But only one company did that. I'm curious, have you come across that before?
Yeah, so many companies might use HackerRank test, but like that test has nothing to do with their preparation platform. So you could prepare on any website and the questions, they won't have the same questions. So yeah, that test is like its own thing. So I think like practicing on HackerRank wouldn't like help or hurt you with that test versus practicing anywhere else. So yeah, and I think your comment about they generate test cases for use, so it becomes faster. I think counterintuitively, it actually makes your preparation slower because you spend a lot of time fixing those small test cases, which in a real interview, like you don't even care about typically, and also because of that, you don't develop your skill of verifying your own code. So it actually makes you slower eventually, and I think what you'll notice is that it's very common to spend half an hour just trying to fix those small, tiny test cases.
Good point.
So
Good
it's
point.
a giant waste of time.
Good point. That particular company phrased, they framed the HackerRank test as like a prereq for an on-site. So that was interesting. I've never seen that before. Maybe it was a little misleading. Maybe it was a prereq for a phone interview, for phone coding interview. But I just thought it's interesting. Time test. Yeah. Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, a lot of companies do that now. Cool. All right. So yeah, we're out of time. Thanks a lot, everyone, for all your questions. They were all really good. And hopefully the session with Rob and me was helpful. Yeah, so thanks for attending. We'll see you guys next week.
This conference will now be recorded.